Hi, and welcome back. Now we're almost ready to get into the meat and potatoes of the study skills and tricks that I'm going to teach you. But really quickly before I do that, I wanted to tell you a quick story about why I'm teaching this class and what motivated me to want to teach this class. And it all goes back to when I was in college and I was studying art. And in order to get a fine art degree, you have to take art history classes. And in order to get a decent grade in art history, you have to sit through lectures in a lecture hall with hundreds of people, and for an hour or two a day, the professor shows slides of different pieces of artwork, and then he tells you who the work was by, the date that it was created, and a story about what is significant about the piece of art. So everybody's out in the audience taking notes, and then of course you have the opportunity to access that information after the fact so that you can review the slides, and then you take a big test, and you have to identify about 80 different pieces of artwork and the artist's name, the date that it was created, and then write an essay about the piece. And many of you will be able to relate to this. In the past, I've been well known for having a terrible memory. And if you have a terrible memory, then when it comes to memorizing hundreds of dates and names so that you can write down 80 of them on a test for your grade, that can be one of the most overwhelming and intimidating experiences ever. But what I did was I took a step back and I just admitted to myself that I was never going to be able to remember all of those dates. I took a deeper look into the course structure and into the grading structure, and what I realized was that the date portion of the test was only worth about 5% of your overall grade, which means that if you missed every date but got everything else, you'd still get a 95% on the test. The names of the artists for each slide were worth 15%. So if you were to miss all of the names of the artists and still get everything else right, the most you could get would be an 85% on the test. And the essay portion was worth the remaining 80%. So when I stepped back and I analyzed what was important to study, I realized that number one, by far and away, was the essay portion. And I'm good at understanding concepts and remembering stories and interesting things like that. So I knew that I could study that and that I could at least do pretty well writing a story about each of the pieces of artwork. And I also knew that I stood a decent chance of remembering the names of the artists because that's part of the story and it's still a fairly interesting bit of information to me. So I went to a bunch of study groups with my fellow students, and I coordinated with a few people to study the concepts. And what we did was we basically talked about the stories behind each piece of artwork. And then we talked about who the artist was, and we really cemented our knowledge and our understanding of the background and the story of each piece. Another group sat down and painstakingly drilled themselves using flashcards to try and remember the dates of each piece. And of course they also studied the artist names and the stories and concepts behind each piece of art. But what I noticed was that they got really hung up on the dates. The reason they got hung up on it is because when they quizzed themselves later to try and see if they could remember these hundreds of dates, they found themselves failing miserably. And so what did they do? They put more and more energy into studying the dates and less energy into studying the concepts and the artist names and the stories behind the work, which was the bulk of the value of the test. So as you can imagine, when test time came, they went into the test feeling stressed out and overwhelmed and angry at the instructor for making it so difficult on them, whereas the small group that I was studying with went into the test knowing that we were going to miss every date on that test because we didn't study the dates at all. But we had confidence that we were going to be able to take care of the other important 95% of the test. And even if we missed a few of those things, which we knew we would, we could still have a pretty solid chance of coming out with an 80 to 90% on the test. Those of us in my group that studied the parts of the test that were weighted heavily did well. Most of us landed in the upper 80s to mid 80s. Whereas the group that focused on the dates and tried to drill those dates into their heads and created a bunch of anxiety for themselves wound up with grades in the lower 70s to upper 70s because they hadn't spent enough time on what was heavily weighted on the test. And I realize that you can't always study like that, but more often than not, if you understand what to look for and you strategize how you study and what you study, and you see the big picture, then even when a situation seems impossible, by using the right strategy and the right techniques, you can make the best of the situation and make the process of studying and preparing for that situation a lot less painful. So that's the gist of why I'm teaching this course, and those are the kinds of strategies that I'm going to try and share with you, along with a bunch of other things about how to motivate yourself to study, how to schedule your study time effectively, and even things like when to use caffeine and when not to, how to organize your studying on your own with groups, and lots of little tips to really make you an awesome studier so that you won't be in the group that kills yourself and still winds up with a 70% on your test. Now let's dive right in and get you started learning how to study. I'll see you in the next lecture.